In a smoky Victorian parlor, a stout Russian noblewoman leans forward, fixing her piercing blue eyes on the skeptics before her. With a dramatic flourish, she produces a letter, supposedly delivered by invisible messengers from mystical Tibetan masters. Murmurs ripple through the room. Some scoff at what they see as a stupid parlor trick. Others gaze in awe, convinced they have just witnessed real magic. Such was the charisma and controversy surrounding Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, better known as Madame Blavatsky. As the co-founder of the Theosophical Society in 1875 and author of influential occult works, she stands as one of the most fascinating figures of 19th century esotericism. Champion to her followers and arch-impostor to her critics, she traversed the globe in search of hidden wisdom, claimed contact with otherworldly masters, and ultimately sparked a spiritual movement that still remains fascinating to this day. As for her life, that is an adventure novel of its own, filled with exotic travel, secret brotherhoods, and metaphysical revelations, but also one rife with paradox. You see, Blavatsky was an aristocrat, but she also consorted with rebels and holy men, a self-proclaimed skeptic who nonetheless reported miracles, a spiritual teacher accused of fraud. So how exactly did this eccentric Russian mystic help ignite a revival of the occult and Eastern thought in the West? And what truth or fiction lay behind her claims of occult powers? If you will come with me for the next hour, we can find out as we explore the life of Helena Blavatsky. But allow me to welcome you to the channel first. Good to see any newcomers. Hello and nice to meet you. And once again, I want to begin with the customary thanks to the Patreon members and the YouTube members who help keep this channel, with all of its videos and all of its playlists, completely ad-free. Because on this channel, we don't like ads either, so we don't put them in. We are supported by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who choose to have a look at the merch store, and the occasional donation through Patreon, through PayPal rather, and the YouTube Super Chats, which certainly helps. But short of that, give it a like, subscribe, comment, and hit the hype button, all the good algorithm-boosting things, and tell your friends about us, our little ad-free sanctuary, right here on YouTube. Now, with all that being said, I won't say anything more about it. Let's begin. And our story begins in a little town on the Dnieper River in the Russian Empire. Today it's Dnipro in Ukraine, but back then it was called Ekaterinoslav, and it was there on August 12th, 1831, where Helena Petrovna Hahn was born. She came into the world amid quite a bit of privilege and culture. Her father was Peter von Hahn, an officer in the Imperial Cavalry, and her mother, Helena Andreevna, a respected novelist. And notably, her mother even translated the mystical novels of English writer Edward Bulwer Lytton into Russian. Perhaps this is what sparked Helena's early fascination with the occult. Indeed, from her mother, who tragically died when Helena was only 11 years old, the young girl inherited a love of literature, but also a defiant imagination. Raised thereafter by maternal grandparents, Helena roamed freely through her grandfather's extensive library of esoteric and mystical works. But she also traveled with her father's military assignments to various corners of the Russian Empire to get an exposure to the diverse cultures that likely fueled her early curiosity and a little bit of wanderlust. Family lore holds that one ancestor had been a Rosicrucian, and Helena eagerly devoured tales of alchemists, magicians, and all sorts of hidden mysteries. By her teenage years, she was largely self-educated, fluent in multiple languages, an utterly absorbed woman in arcane lore, far beyond the typical curriculum of a young noblewoman, that is for sure. But stories of Blavatsky's youth hint at the psychic sensitivities and theatrical flair that would characterize her later life. Her sister recalled that Helena would gather the younger children in a dark room at twilight and regale them with fantastical tales, which she herself was the heroine of nightly adventures. And even as a child, she blurred the line between imagination and reality, foreshadowing the creative myth-making of her later years. She even spoke of a protective, oriental figure who appeared to her in moments of danger, a spectral guardian she would later identify as one of her occult masters. A little later, at 17 years old, Helena entered a brief and ill-fated marriage to Nikifor Blavatsky, a much older provincial governor. Within a few months of the 1848 wedding, the independent-minded bride scandalized society by leaving her husband and simply striking out on her own. For this bold escape certainly set a tone for the rest of her life, but she did adopt her husband's surname. Madame Blavatsky now, instead of Madame Hahn, began decades of restless wandering across 3 continents in pursuit of what she called ancient wisdom. And so, for the next 2 decades, she traveled extensively. By her own later accounts, she roamed through Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas, always seeking out esoteric teachers and knowledge. In one episode she described occurring in London in 1851, she claimed that she encountered a mysterious Hindu sage, the very Master Maurya, who had appeared to her in visions, and he told her that she had a special mission to pursue in the East. Thus inspired, she embarked on a global quest. Blavatsky later recounted colorful tales of studying voodoo in New Orleans, consulting mystics in Egypt, living with ascetic dervishes in West Asia, and even venturing into the most remote Himalayan regions. She claimed that an early attempt to enter Tibet in the 1850s was thwarted by British authorities, but that she succeeded on a second try a few years later. She also spoke of surviving a shipwreck off the Cape of Good Hope, and of briefly earning a living as a concert pianist in Europe, episodes that stretched a bit of credulity, but certainly managed to enhance her mystique. At one point, she even boasted of fighting in Italy alongside the revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi in 1867, a highly questionable tale that nonetheless burnished her legend as an adventuress. But the climax of her narrative was her alleged success in reaching Tibet in around 1868 and finding her long-sought masters. In the hidden monasteries of the Himalayas, she said, she spent some time under the tutelage of Master Maurya and his colleague Kut Homi, who taught her the secret wisdom religion and helped her refine and control her psychic abilities. Now, unsurprisingly, many biographers have expressed doubt about the more fantastical elements of Blavatsky's travelogue. 19th century Tibet was infamously off-limits to foreign visitors, making her stories of living among the high lamas pretty difficult to verify and, frankly, difficult to believe. But it is likely that Blavatsky interwove fiction with a bit of fact, perhaps exaggerating or inventing certain adventures to construct a more mythic persona. Yet it is also true that she journeyed more widely than almost any woman of her era. She genuinely spent years exploring distant lands, and the experiences and diverse knowledge she gathered would become raw material for the grand spiritual narrative she would later present to the world. She even believed that a near-fatal riding accident in 1864, which left her in a coma for months, had unlocked the full range of her psychic powers upon recovery. By the early 1870s, spiritualism, the popular craze of communicating with the dead via seances, was well and truly in full swing. Helena Blavatsky had witnessed and investigated spiritualist phenomena herself, but she maintained a critical stance towards its claims. She did not deny the reality of uncanny occurrences. On the contrary, she defended the genuine existence of many mediumistic phenomena. However, Blavatsky adamantly rejected the common spiritualist belief that seance apparitions and messages came from the souls of departed loved ones. In her view, mediums were usually contacting interpersonal astral forces, or the lingering psychic shells of the dead. Essentially, empty remnants of human personalities, often manipulated by trickster entities. True spirit communication, she argued, was quite rare. Most seances only scratched the surface of the unseen world. Spiritualism, Blavatsky scoffed, was a game for amateurs, distracting people from the deeper occult truth. The serious seeker, she insisted, must dig further into the hidden laws of nature and develop one's own latent psychic powers, rather than passively relying on spirit mediums to do it all for them. Blavatsky's ambivalence towards spiritualism was reinforced by hard experience. In 1871, during a sojourn in Cairo, she attempted to find a spiritualist or spiritist society. Teaming up with an American medium, Emma Cutting, she established a short-lived Spirit Society, inspired by the Spiritism of Allan Kardec, which, unlike the mainstream Anglo-American spiritualism, included belief in reincarnation. But from the outset, Blavatsky grew suspicious that the mediums involved were performing fraudulent tricks. Her intuition proved to be correct. Before long, the recruited medium was exposed as a complete and utter fake. Blavatsky, disgusted by this deception, shut down the Cairo Circle after just 2 weeks of operating. And this Egyptian fiasco in general cemented her distrust of, quote, professional mediums. Well, she included that while supernatural phenomena could be genuine, many self-proclaimed mediums resorted to cheating whenever a real spirit contact failed to occur. The lesson she drew was pretty clear. One should develop one's own psychic abilities and investigate the occult firsthand, rather than put blind faith in hired seance performers. And so, in July of 1873, Blavatsky arrived back in New York City to start a new chapter. Virtually unknown in America, too. She was in her 40s now, a Russian noblewoman, turned mystic adrift a bustling metropolis. And with scant resources, she found lodging in the Women's Housing Cooperative on Madison Street in Manhattan's Lower East Side. In this quasi-communal home for working women, she survived by eking out a living through piecework, sewing clothes, crafting advertising cards, drawing on the practical skills that she'd picked up in her travels. Despite language barriers, her English was still not the best, and living hand to mouth, Blavatsky soon gravitated into the city's metaphysical and spiritualist circles. She befriended local spiritualists, occult enthusiasts, and journalists, eagerly absorbing the American esoteric scene. An interview in the New York Sun in 1874 marked her first presence, and the first hint of the colorful persona for which she would become known for. And it was during this period, too, that a stroke of fortune briefly eased her struggles. News arrived that her father had died back in Russia. Now, of course, this wasn't good news, but silver linings. It left her with a modest inheritance. Suddenly, she had a bit of funds behind her, and Blavatsky upgraded her quarters from the tenement commune to a comfortable hotel. But far from retiring into bourgeois respectability, she poured her energy and money into the real mission that had brought her to America, the quest to rally like-minded seekers and explore those occult mysteries. But the turning point came in the autumn of 1874. Reports of dramatic ghostly phenomena at a farmhouse in Chittenden, Vermont, the home of the Eddy brothers, famous spirit mediums, by the way, were making headlines in the spiritualist press. Sensing an important opportunity, Blavatsky traveled to the Eddy homestead in October of 1874 to see these marvels for herself. There, amid the nightly seances of materialized phantoms and levitating objects, she crossed paths with Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, a Civil War veteran turned lawyer and journalist. Olcott had been dispatched by the Daily Graphic newspaper to investigate the phenomena with a more skeptical view. When Blavatsky arrived, conspicuous in her eccentric attire, Olcott's first reaction was one of bemusement. He later recalled seeing at the dining room a stout middle-aged woman in a bright red Garibaldi shirt, her thick flaxen hair cut short and unruly like the fleece of a Cotswold ewe. Well, this curious lady promptly stepped outside after the meal to roll herself up a cigarette, which Olcott gallantly lit for her as a pretext to strike up a conversation. Thus began a pretty instant and natural friendship, and Blavatsky admitted as well that she had hesitated to visit the site of this supposed paranormal activity, quote, because she was afraid of meeting that Colonel Olcott, fearing he might publicize her. After all, he was skeptical of everything anyway. But the thing was, Olcott immediately put her at ease and assured her that he wouldn't be printing anything without her expressed consent. And that's probably the best guarantee you can get, I suppose. In any case, over the ensuing days, Olcott had ample chances to observe Blavatsky's remarkable paranormal talents. The Eddy seances were impressive, but they were chaotic. Apparitions of deceased persons seemed to appear from a spirit cabinet, yet suspicions of trickery persisted. When Blavatsky joined the circle, however, the phenomena took on a startling new character. Olcott reported that mysterious raps sounded on the walls and tables at Blavatsky's command, sometimes occurring even when she sat across the room. If an invisible force answered to her, as if an invisible force answered to her will. Now lights danced around and objects moved without anyone except possibly Blavatsky near them. Blavatsky later hinted to Olcott that she was using her own psychic energy to produce or enhance the manifestations, showing how easily seance phenomena could mislead the observer. But for the practical-minded Olcott, these experiences were very transformative. Here was a medium of a wholly different order, a no-nonsense, worldly Russian woman, who not only possessed authentic psychic powers, but could also explain the underlying occult principles. As Olcott noted, Blavatsky didn't even like the term spiritualism for these occurrences. She distinguished between the popular Western spiritualism and a more profound Eastern spirituality, which was rooted in the older ancient wisdom. Intrigued and impressed, Olcott wrote a series of newspaper articles praising Blavatsky's knowledge of phenomena. The two became inseparable in inquiry, affectionately nicknaming each other Maloney and Jack, respectively, for Olcott and Blavatsky, as their friendship deepened. By early 1875, Blavatsky was already privately tutoring Olcott in occult philosophy, and under her influence he even adopted a more ascetic lifestyle. She persuaded him to give up alcohol and meat, at least for a time. The skeptic turned believer would soon help Blavatsky channel their shared enthusiasm into a more concrete organization. Inspired by their mutual passion to uncover these hidden truths, Blavatsky, Olcott, and a small circle of compatriots conceived the idea of a society dedicated to systematic occult study. On a brisk evening in New York City, November 17, 1875, they formally began the Theosophical Society. Now the name's a bit weird, I know. The name Theosophy, meaning divine wisdom, was suggested by Charles Sotheran, one of the early members, harking back to the ancient Neoplatonic and mystical usage. In any case, everybody agreed that it sounded really cool, I'm sure. They were then joined by lawyer William Tran Judge as a co-founder, along with about a dozen other like-minded truth-seekers, as they were called, approximately about 16 founding members in total. Colonel Olcott was elected the Society's first president. Judge became recording secretary. And Blavatsky, well, she took up the role of corresponding secretary, and quite fittingly so, since she was the group's intellectual powerhouse and spiritual linchpin. From the outset, the Theosophical Society announced ambitious aims. They envisioned nothing less than a worldwide movement to revolutionize humanity's understanding of religion, science, and of course our own latent capacities. The Society's mission was often summarized in three core objectives, the first being universal brotherhood, basically forming a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, one that transcends distinctions of creed, race, gender, social rank, caste. The next was comparative study, to encourage the comparative study of religion, science, and philosophy together, by examining the wisdom of East and West, ancient and modern. Theosophists sought to uncover the common truths that linked them all together. No single creed or scientific dogma held all the answers, but taken together they might illuminate the divine wisdom at the core. The next was investigating mysteries of nature and man, that is, to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the physical powers latent in humankind. Rather than taking supernatural claims on faith, the Society encouraged first-hand inquiry into phenomena like clairvoyance, mesmerism, and psychic healing, approaching them in a spirit of open-minded research. Lofty principles, that is for sure, but they certainly set the Theosophical Society apart from any orthodox church or spiritualist circle. It was something different, something unique. Blavatsky insisted that Theosophy was not about founding a new sect or belief system, but rather about seeking truth without dogma, an open-minded inquisitiveness, I suppose. Now, membership required no one to abandon their personal beliefs, but only to sympathize with the broad ideals of brotherhood and open inquiry. Early society meetings held in Blavatsky's own apartment featured lectures on esoteric topics and lively discussions among an eclectic group, mystics and scientists, Freemasons and journalists, men and women too, which was a notable thing in Victorian times, all united by curiosity about the unseen. Among the prominent figures drawn into the Society's orbit in 1875 with the spiritualist author Emma Hardinge Britten, the inventor Thomas Edison, and even the former Civil War General Abner Doubleday, illustrating the wide appeal of Theosophy's message. To give the nascent movement a manifesto and reach a broader public, Blavatsky turned to writing her first major book, and in 1877 it was all done. She published Isis Unveiled, a sprawling 2-volume work subtitled A Master Key to the Mysteries of Ancient and Modern Science and Theology. This opus was part spiritual polemic, part encyclopedic survey of the world's esoteric traditions. Blavatsky poured into it the vast range of arcane knowledge she had accumulated, and she boldly challenged the materialism of contemporary science and the blind dogmatism of Orthodox Christianity alike. Neither, she argued, had a monopoly on the truth. Instead, Isis Unveiled proclaimed the existence of an ancient, universal wisdom tradition, a secret doctrine or ageless wisdom religion which underlied all of the world's faith. If rediscovered, this primal truth could reconcile science with spirituality and offer answers to those riddles of existence. Pretty exciting stuff. No wonder so many people wanted to join up, I suppose. Definitely an interesting age of fascination back in those times. Well, Blavatsky's writing process for Isis Unveiled was as extraordinary as the book itself. She began the project in 1875, and much of it was written during a stay at the home of Professor Hiram Corson in Ithaca, New York. Professor Corson later recalled his amazement at Blavatsky's method of work. She would sit propped up in bed and write from morning till past midnight, smoking ridiculous amounts of cigarettes, with piles of reference books around her, many of them not even in English or Russian, but other languages. Pretty impressive. The pages were flowing rapidly. She seemed to have at her mental fingertips a whole library of obscure texts. Blavatsky would quote long passages verbatim from rare books that Corson was, quote, perfectly certain there were no copies of at that time in America, according to reporters. When she needed to check an old-world idiom or a Sanskrit term, she would holler to her host in the next room for a little help with the phrasing. And even more intriguingly, Blavatsky claimed that much of the content was inspired by hidden adepts. She spoke of another consciousness or lodger within her that guided the writing. On occasion, as Olcott attested, her penmanship would change mid-paragraph, as if different somebodies were taking turns dictating the manuscript. Blavatsky herself said she sometimes saw astral visions of the very pages she needed to quote, and simply transcribed what she saw. Professor Corson admitted that, however implausible such claims sounded, that he found it much easier to believe her statement than to account for her quotations by any ordinary explanation of memory, given the sheer volume of precise citations she produced from the inaccessible works. In short, writing Isis Unveiled was, for Blavatsky, an occult exercise in itself, a testament to the mysterious wellsprings of knowledge that she tapped into. So when Isis Unveiled debuted in the fall of 1877, it caused a sensation in American metaphysical circles. The book's first print run of 1,000 copies sold out in a single week, surprising even the publisher with its brisk sales. Readers were astonished, in some cases bewildered, by the dazzling array of lore that it contained, from ancient Egyptian and Hindu scriptures to Renaissance alchemy, Kabbalah, spiritualist writings, and cutting-edge Victorian science. Blavatsky marshaled all these sources to argue her central thesis, that modern Western science and religion had both lost sight of the deeper truths which could be found in the ancient wisdom religion once known to Plato, the Hindu sages, and the mystics of the other cultures. She asserted that if you peel back the dogmas of the churches and the narrow hypothesis of scientists, you will find a unifying esoteric truth, a kind of alpha and omega, that had been kept alive through secret brotherhoods and initiates. Such bold ideas naturally grew to a bit of controversy. Mainstream scholars and clergymen gave Isis Unveiled many negative reviews, criticizing its lack of academic rigor and accusing Blavatsky of liberally borrowing from over 100 other books without proper credit. And indeed, the text is quite quotation-heavy. Some cited, some not. Another reflection of Blavatsky's conversational and patchwork writing style. But it didn't matter too much because despite the skeptics, the book's impact was undeniable. It instantly established Blavatsky as a formidable new voice in esoteric thought. Isis made converts to Theosophy and attracted curious minds around the globe. Even those who challenged her conclusions had to acknowledge the erudition and audacity on display. As Blavatsky put it, she had thrown down the gauntlet to both materialists and theologians, urging them to consider that ancient wisdom might hold the key to bridging science and spirituality. And so the success of Isis Unveiled gave the fledgling Theosophical Society a huge boost in visibility, but also legitimacy. And suddenly, Madame Blavatsky was a name on everyone's lips. By the late 1870s, those who met Blavatsky in the flesh often found her just as fascinating as her books, and she hardly fit the Victorian image of a gentle, ethereal spiritual teacher. Instead, she was a blunt woman with a forceful personality, all wrapped up in a pretty unconventional appearance. A stout woman with penetrating pale eyes and a strong jaw, typically wearing a long flowing robe or eccentric outfits that flouted contemporary fashions. Indoors, she might drape herself in a loose gown. Outdoors, she favored a trademark black cloak and occasionally a colorful peasant handkerchief. She spoke with a throaty, deep voice laced with sarcasm and hearty humor, an earthy Russian candor that often startled the unprepared. But perhaps more scandalously, she was constantly smoking, and everywhere too, puffing on her hand-rolled cigarettes and sometimes a pipe, even in an era when ladies were expected to be prim and proper. But it seems that she could not care less, even to the point where she was rubbing it in society's face. One acquaintance quipped that the sight of her smoking like a steamboat was enough to shock any genteel church matron. Blavatsky herself joked about her style, quote, "An old woman whose features, even in my youth, never made her appear pretty. A woman whose uncouth manners and masculine habits are enough to frighten any bustled and corseted fine lady out of her wits." And so she relished being a bit of a shock to polite society. Well, yet for all of her rough edges, as we can call them, Blavatsky's charisma was undeniable. Once she began to speak on a metaphysical topic, even her skeptics often fell under the spell of her knowledge. Her conversation was famously wide-ranging and erudite. She could discuss Buddhist sutras, Vedantic concepts, European philosophers, occult symbols, and scientific theories, all at once, and with an encyclopedic-like recall of details. One reporter who visited her New York apartment came away calling Blavatsky a veritable sphinx, which is quite a Victorian compliment. She could be cryptic and wise, posing riddles and answering questions, with teasing hints rather than direct replies. And indeed many found her to be an enigma, simultaneously a down-to-earth, profane grandmother figure and a vessel for otherworldly insights. As a German admirer later wrote, anyone who met her in person could only speak of her with admiration, assuming they were open-minded. But those who could not fathom the depths of her character, well, to them she must remain a riddle. Blavatsky often delighted in confounding in the expectations of disciples and critics alike. He was quick to poke fun at pretension, sometimes with a bit of biting sarcasm, yet also capable of deep compassion and generous friendship. In New York, her unconventional magnetism drew a steady stream of seekers to her society's gatherings, many of which took place in her own lodgings on Irving Place. Curiosity seekers came to see Madame Blavatsky in all her bohemian glory, lounging amid exotic bric-a-brac, puffing on cigarettes, perhaps with her pet parrot on her shoulder, holding court about ancient Atlantis, or the nature of karma. When they got there, they found a woman who was at once kindly and formidable. She had little patience for fools, but a genuine affection for earnest students. Under her influence, the society in America grew steadily. By 1878, new theosophical branches had sprouted in major cities like Boston and Philadelphia, and even as far as London. Blavatsky handled an enormous correspondence with inquirers worldwide, energetically spreading the gospel of Theosophy through letters and articles. Notable figures in literature and science were starting to take notice of the movement. The stage was set, of course, for Theosophy to expand beyond America's shores, and Blavatsky knew her work in the West was only beginning. Restless and sensing a greater destiny, Blavatsky decided that it was time to move on. She had long felt a pull towards India, the land as she regarded as a wellspring of the ancient wisdom. And so in 1879, only a few years after Isis Unveiled was published, she and Colonel Olcott set sail for Bombay, intent on establishing the Theosophical Society in India. For Blavatsky, this was something of a return, given her early travels in South Asia, but she arrived as the leader of an organized movement this time. The British colonial authorities, eyeing a Russian expatriate with suspicion, were not particularly welcoming. Nevertheless, Blavatsky and Olcott quickly found common ground with various Indian intellectuals and religious reformers. The late 19th century was a time of cultural awakening in India, with figures like Swami Dayananda Saraswati urging the revival of Vedic knowledge through his Arya Samaj movement, and others seeking to more so modernize Indian spirituality. Theosophy's message of a universal brotherhood and respect for Eastern religions resonated with many educated Indians who chafed under British dismissals of their traditions. But here was a Western woman proclaiming the greatness of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, a pretty startling turnaround from the usual colonial attitudes. In Bombay, Blavatsky started a magazine called The Theosophist. In 1879, this became an important forum for East-West dialogue, and she wrote article after article on topics ranging from the symbolism of the Bhagavad Gita to the nature of psychic phenomena, while also publishing essays by Hindu and Buddhist scholars for global readership. Blavatsky's own paranormal exploits continue to be a source of fascination. Indian associates and British officials alike reported witnessing peculiar incidents around her. Unexplained noises, objects moving around on their own, or the uncanny appearance of letters seemingly delivered by no ordinary means. Helena hinted that her masters, the Tibetan adepts that is, were guiding her still, even delivering correspondence to her by occult post. These were the famous Mahatma letters, notes said to precipitate out of thin air, often in response to questions from theosophists like A.P. Sinnett, a British journalist based in India. But one of the most influential friendships she formed in India was with Alfred Percy Sinnett, the editor of the Pioneer, as we just mentioned, and this was a prominent English-language newspaper in Allahabad. Sinnett was deeply intrigued by Theosophy and by Blavatsky's powers. In 1880, he invited her and Olcott to Simla, the Himalayan hill station where the colonial elite spent their summers. There, in the cool mountain air, Blavatsky astounded Sinnett and his wife with feats that Sinnett carefully documented. During a picnic in the Simla woods, for instance, a lady mentioned wistfully that she had lost a cherished antique brooch months before. Blavatsky, after going into a brief, trance-like concentration, announced that the brooch would be found nearby. And sure enough, after a search, the missing brooch was discovered on the ground, wrapped inexplicably in fresh paper. A gift, it seems, delivered by those unseen masters, as Blavatsky claimed. On another occasion, Blavatsky reportedly caused letters from her Mahatma teachers to materialize inside sealed envelopes or in remote locations. Sinnett was thrilled. Here was apparent proof of the hidden Eastern adepts Blavatsky spoke of. And he wrote 2 books as a result, The Occult World in 1881, which described these encounters and phenomena in India, and in 1883, Esoteric Buddhism, which conveyed the spiritual teachings from the Mahatma letters. Despite its title, the book was more Theosophy than Orthodox Buddhism. In any case, these works stirred excitement in the West and attracted new seekers to Theosophy, eager to learn more of the mysterious masters behind Madame Blavatsky. And so, under her guidance, the Theosophical Society flourished in India. Branches opened in cities like Bombay, Madras, and Ceylon, which that's what they used to call Sri Lanka. In Ceylon in 1880, Blavatsky and Olcott made headlines by formally converting to Buddhism, the first Westerners to do so in that era, by the way. They took the 5 precepts from a Sinhalese Buddhist monk, signaling respect for the Buddhist faith. This act endeared them to many local people. Olcott even became known for his work in reviving Buddhist education in Ceylon. Blavatsky's identification with India's and Ceylon's religions gave her an almost celebrity-like status among certain circles. Some Indian nationalists later recalled her and Olcott with fondness as Westerners who truly valued Indian spiritual teachings. But not everything went smoothly. Blavatsky attempted an alliance with Swami Dayananda's Hindu reform movement, but it fell apart amid a few mutual misunderstandings rather. Dayananda, a staunch Vedic purist, grew suspicious of Theosophy's eclectic approach, and perhaps of Blavatsky's claims of secret masters. And by 1882, he publicly denounced the Theosophists as charlatans, which Blavatsky in turn answered with her own barbed criticisms. Nevertheless, the society pressed on, and in late 1882 Blavatsky and her colleagues established a new international headquarters in Adyar, a suburban district of Madras in South India. And by the way, Madras is now called Chennai, I should add. Well, the Adyar compound, with its spacious garden on the Adyar River, became the heart of the Theosophical world movement going forward. The period from 1879 to 1884 marked the high tide of Blavatsky's influence and activity, but it was also a time of sowing the seeds of turmoil. She was working incessantly, writing, mentoring new disciples, and orchestrating occult demonstrations. Despite recurring health problems, she was suffering from kidney and heart ailments. Those around her sometimes witnessed her go into intense trances, or bear the strain of churning out pages of spiritual correspondence day and night. Her dedication inspired great loyalty, but her volatile temperament also led to friction with staff and associates. In particular, a storm was brewing at Adyar in the form of a couple named Emma and Alexis Colum. The Colums were acquaintances of Blavatsky, and she had taken them in. They helped with household matters at the headquarters, but by 1884, things were not so friendly. That year, while Blavatsky was on a visit to Europe, the Colums turned against her and made explosive allegations. They claimed that the vaunted Mahatma letters and other wonders at Adyar were fabricated with mundane tricks. To back up their charges, they produced letters, allegedly written by Blavatsky to Emma Colum, that contained instructions for faking spiritual phenomena, including references to secret doors in Blavatsky's rooms and hidden mechanisms for simulating apparitions. These letters were published by Christian missionaries in Madras who were eager to discredit Blavatsky, whom they of course saw as a threat to their proselytizing efforts. The Colum affair, as it came to be known, was a bombshell. Newspapers in India and Europe seized on the scandal, debating whether the famous occultist had been finally unmasked as a fraud. Theosophists loyal to Blavatsky either dismissed the Colum letters as forgeries, or argued that they were private jokes taken out of context. Blavatsky herself, returning from Europe to face the crisis, vehemently denied instructing anyone to cheat. But the damage was done. Doubt had been cast on every claim of paranormal aid that she ever invoked. Sensing a threat to the Society's credibility, some members in London approached the Society for Psychical Research in Britain to investigate the phenomena. Blavatsky agreed, hoping an impartial inquiry would vindicate her. In late 1884, the SPR, as the Society for Psychical Research is abbreviated, sent a young researcher, Richard Hodgson, to India. Hodgson interviewed witnesses, inspected Blavatsky's quarters, where he did find secret trapdoors in the wall, though Theosophers said these predated her occupancy. So, I don't know. But he also gathered testimony from disaffected insiders like the Colums. The result? It was devastating for Blavatsky. In 1885, the SPR published the report, which flatly concluded that Helena Blavatsky was an impostor, one of the most ingenious, accomplished, and interesting frauds in history. His words, not mine. Well, he asserted that the Mahatma letters were penned by Blavatsky herself in disguised handwriting, and that she had engineered fake miracles. Hodgson even insinuated that she might have been a Russian agent spying under the cover of a spiritual movement, but they had pretty scant proof for that theory. The SPR report gave Victorian science a seal of disapproval, and from that point onward, mainstream opinion in the West increasingly labeled Blavatsky as a trickster. It was a bitter blow to her reputation, and decades later, in 1986, an SBR member named Vernon Harrison re-examined Hodgson's work and concluded that it was deeply flawed and biased, effectively challenging the validity of the original verdict. But of course, such reconsideration comes along quite a bit too late. For Blavatsky personally, the immediate consequences were as dire as they could be. Exhausted and ill, she felt hounded by enemies, and at times completely unsupported by those who had once admired her. And so in March of 1885, she left India, never to return, heartbroken to depart the land she loved under a cloud of accusation. As she sailed westward, it seemed possible that the Theosophical Society might not survive the scandal. Yet Blavatsky was not going to abandon her mission. Though physically broken, she retained her spirit and resolved to continue the work of spreading Theosophy from a new base in Europe. Blavatsky spent her last 6 years, from 1885 to 1891, in Europe, a period that proved both intensely productive but personally challenging. Initially, she went to Germany and Belgium to recuperate. During 1885 to 86, she lived quietly in Würzburg and then Ostend, attended by a small circle of loyal students and friends. One of them was Countess Constance Wachtmeister, a Swedish noblewoman who became Blavatsky's companion and helper. The Countess later recalled how, despite recurring bouts of heart trouble and nephritis, Helena would still sit at her desk, writing from early morning until the evening, with only brief pauses for meals. What occupied Blavatsky so fervently was the writing of her magnum opus, The Secret Doctrine. This massive work, published in 2 volumes in 1888, was subtitled The Synthesis of Science, Religion and Philosophy, and it aimed at nothing less than to outline an occult history of the cosmos and humanity. The Secret Doctrine built upon themes from Isis Unveiled, but it went further in systematizing Blavatsky's esoteric worldview. It presented itself as a commentary on an ancient text called the Book of Dzyan, verses that Blavatsky claimed to have translated from archaic Senzar manuscripts that she saw in Tibet. Hard to prove her wrong, I suppose. The first volume dealt with cosmic evolution, describing how the universe and life emerged through vast cycles, or rounds, and how spiritual essence gradually densified into matter and then into time, and would return to the spirit. The second volume focused on human evolution, introducing Blavatsky's elaborate schema of root races, successive great civilizations or stages of humanity leading up to our present state and projecting into the future. With this sweeping cosmology, Blavatsky interwove ideas from Hindu cosmology, Buddhist thought, Western alchemy and Kabbalah, and even contemporary scientific theories. She suggested that Darwinian evolution was just one part of a much grander spiritual evolution guided by karma and cosmic law. Well, to the average reader, The Secret Doctrine was and remains quite challenging. It's a dense, arcane book with spanning mythology, science, and history. A lot of prior reading required. It's worse than that big blue book from Aleister Crowley. I have a good friend in Australia who has that one. He's had it for about 20 years and he hasn't even read it yet. It's quite intimidating. About 2,000 pages long, I think. Well, anyway. Yet for those drawn to occult ideas, it became a kind of Bible for Theosophy, The Secret Doctrine, that is, and it showcased Blavatsky's erudition and imaginative power, attempting to synthesize vast realms of knowledge into a single grand narrative. Some contemporaries marveled at how one woman could command such breadth of material. Others noted that she borrowed heavily from earlier authors, and indeed critics accused her of plagiarizing numerous sources in her books. But regardless, the secret doctrine cemented Blavatsky's status as the preeminent occult teacher of her time. But it also attached a new wave of converts to the Theosophical Society, especially in Europe and America, where interest in alternative spirituality was on the rise. By mid-1887, Blavatsky had relocated to London, deciding that the heart of the British Empire would be her next field of work. In London she was welcomed by a number of seekers and intellectuals who had read her books and were eager to meet the notorious Madame Blavatsky in person. Despite, or perhaps partly because of her scandalous reputation, she became a magnet for truth-seekers of all stripes. Among those who came into her orbit was a former Anglican clergyman turned mystic, Charles Webster Leadbeater, and a brilliant Irish-born reformer, Annie Besant. Now Besant, her conversion to Theosophy became one of Blavatsky's proudest achievements. Initially a skeptic and secularist, Besant was won over after reading The Secret Doctrine and then meeting its author. She would later recall that Blavatsky's presence and wisdom profoundly changed her life. Besant soon emerged as a close confidant that would go on to carry the Theosophical torch after Blavatsky's passing. In London, she established a new esoteric circle. She started an English Theosophical journal, cheekily titled Lucifer, meaning light-bringer, which raised a few pious eyebrows in Victorian society, no doubt. But she also formed an inner esoteric section of the Theosophical Society for her most dedicated students, entrusting them with deeper spiritual exercises and teachings. Around this time, she produced two more notable books, The Key to Theosophy in 1889, which expounded the theosophical doctrines in a clear question-and-answer dialogue, and The Voice of Silence, 1889, a slender collection of devotional aphorisms that she claimed to have translated from an ancient Egyptian scripture. What this scripture was, she conveniently left out. Well, the works did further spread her ideas and offered guidance to those seeking to live by theosophical principles. Though her health continued to deteriorate, she worked tirelessly. She gave weekly meetings at the Blavatsky Lodge in London, wrote articles and answered correspondence from inquirers around the world, and guided new disciples. But by 1890, she was physically frail, overweight, often confined to a chair by rheumatism, but with a mind as sharp and bold as ever. May 8th, 1891. She passed away at the age of 59 from complications of influenza. On the night before she died, she had turned to a close disciple and implored, "Keep the link unbroken. Do not let my last incarnation be a failure." This plea was Blavatsky's final message to her followers, urging them to carry on the Society's mission. Her death made international news. Even newspapers that had mocked her in the past noted that a remarkable woman had passed from the scene. Honoring her wishes, her friends had her body cremated. Her ashes were divided and sent to three places that were dearest to her: India, the United States, and England. Soon after, her devotees instituted an annual celebration on May 8th, White Lotus Day, on which readings from the Bhagavad Gita and The Voice of Silence, one of her last books, commemorate her life and legacy. And I hope I did her justice in telling her story. Ultimately, she remains a bit of a mystery, I think. She was a woman of contradictions, professing pretty lofty ethics and a universal brotherhood, while displaying a fierce temper and egoism too, ridiculing charlatans while being accused of ingenious deceit. But those close to her spoke very warmly of her, that she had a good heart and generosity beneath her gruff exterior. She could curse like a sailor and roar with laughter at a joke, yet also discourse intellectually for hours on the metaphysics of the soul, and that complexity makes her a pretty fascinating character in retrospect. By the time of her death, even her retractors had to admit that Blavatsky had been a force to be reckoned with. And as a final note, as one newspaper eulogized, she was one of the most remarkable women of the century, having catalyzed a worldwide revival of interest in mysticism and the occult. And that's where we leave it. So thank you so much for listening. What a fascinating character. I'm going to thank my top tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carey, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Nephthys, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Gordsey, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakian, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolf's Vein, Dude, Brinny, Aiden, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Pesty Hun, Stevie, and Jessica. Thank you very much. And that's all I have for you for tonight. I am exhausted. I have recorded a lot today. So I'm going to go and make myself a little hot chocolate, and I'm going to watch a movie before bed, maybe. I don't know what it is. Maybe something occult-like. Oh, the new Conjuring is out. Maybe I'll give that a try. In any case, thank you for listening. Lots of love to you all, and farewell for now. Good night.